Monotype.
Welcome to Behind the Font, a new miniseries from Monotype that demystifies the challenging corners of the design industry. As any creative will tell you, there's a world of technical challenges that designers face every day. This miniseries aims to dig into the technical side of type and answer questions that we hear all the time here at Monotype. We kicked off this miniseries with a topic that can be confusing for creatives, and pretty much anybody: font licensing. In part 1, we learned what font licenses are and how they have evolved now that anyone can be a publisher. We gave you a crash course on the basics of a font license in part 2. And in this final episode on font licensing, we're going to answer listener questions and other common questions we get from people like you. If you're tuning into this series for the first time, we'd recommend that you listen to parts 1 and 2 first. Then come back and join us here on part 3. And if you have been listening, it's probably no surprise that our very own Vice President and Assistant General Counsel, Phil Carey-Berggren, is back with us one more time. This time to answer your burning questions. Hey, Phil.
Hey, Carl.
Before we start, we just want to make one thing clear. Phil is a lawyer, but he's not your lawyer. Nothing we discuss here should be taken as legal advice. We hope these episodes help clarify some common legal concepts, but please consult with your own attorney for legal advice on your particular scenario. Phil, hope you did some stretching this morning, maybe some yoga, or at least meditated, because, man, I'm about to throw some tough ones at you. How you feeling today?
I feel pretty good. Been kind of a busy day, but hopefully, stretched enough and relaxed enough to get through this. Don't be too hard on me.
I'll try. Let's just start out right out of the gate. In part 2, you walked us through some common font licensing use cases. I'll do a really quick recap. We talked about desktop licensing, web use, mobile apps, web to print, and hardware or OEM. One question we talked about last episode was, why can't you use a font in a web-based project, like for a website you're building, if you've only licensed it for desktop use? I mean, this is a really important question. I think it's one of the more common sort of like misuse situations we see. So why don't you just lay it out for people on how this happens and why it shouldn't happen?
For sure. From a technical perspective, there's nothing preventing you from taking the font and using it in a way that wasn't licensed for. But if you do that, if you do take the font and use it on a website, you're going to be breaching your license. You're going to be probably infringing the IP rights of the font owner, and you're not properly compensating the rights owner for the use that you're enjoying.
And if I'm not mistaken, a big part of the breach is going to be in that impressions count, right? Because a desktop license is for use in a single piece of collateral, even if you print it multiple times or make multiple copies of an image. But here with a website, the usage is counted in a number of impressions. And so if you're getting 1 million of them, you're not licensed for that 1 million. You've got some reconciliation to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, everyone kind of deals with the differences between desktop and web use slightly differently. So for Monotype, it's more about where the font software travels. So for desktop use, it's one person who's using the font on their computer to do their day-to-day work, creating print graphics or something that is physically output, non-digital for the most part. With web, it's all about just having content displayed for anyone who's visiting a site.
Let's say I have purchased a font license for website use, a web font license. Can I use that in a digital ad?
Well, you're going to love this one because it depends.
Oh, it depends. Oh, gosh.
Never heard that one, right?
Never heard that before.
So it really depends on what you mean by using it in an online ad, how the font software is being used, where it travels. And then it also depends on the specific license terms. Between website usage, website licensing, and like digital ad, online ad, sometimes called digital marketing communication licensing, some foundries and some licensors group those together, and you just pay based on page view metrics or impressions, and some licensors split them up. So that's an area where it is really important to understand the restrictions in your EULA.
Okay, next question, Phil. Is there a typical term length for font licensing? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, there are different terms associated with the different license types. Historically, when we've granted desktop licenses, those have been without a term. So they're not necessarily perpetual, but they're in place for as long as the terms are complied with. So if I license a font under a historical desktop license, I have the right to continue using that font until I breach the terms. If I breach the terms, then my rights to license the font end. For other types of licensing, web font apps, it's typically a term of a year or multiple years.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, on the surface, perpetual sounds great because you pay once and you have it forever. And maybe in a lot of situations, perpetual is great for exactly that reason. But, what are some cases where licensing in perpetuity could actually become a challenge?
Yeah, so this relates back to something we talked about in the last episode. Do you remember when I was explaining why there can't really be one font license to rule them all?
One ring to rule them all.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so first of all, in order to price something out on a perpetual license, as an IP licensor, you need to contemplate the entirety of the value over an infinite term and price that out. So that's really difficult, and you end up overcompensating typically. You're either overpricing compared to the average use, or you're limiting the use more restrictively to cover that temporal scope. Mm-hmm. What we've seen in more recent years, over the past decade or so, is a move to term-based licensing, even in the desktop side, which allows licensors to more narrowly tailor and specifically tailor the license grants for their customer bases, as well as their business models. It also allows our customers or font consumers to switch fonts periodically, so you're not locked into a unlimited term license for a particular font. If you decide you want to change branding direction in a few years, you can purchase a different license and you're not losing out on that cost.
Mm-hmm. And with the whole perpetual thing, I mean, it also varies from licensor to licensor, foundry to foundry, I'm sure. Some are happy to license a desktop font for a couple $100, in perpetuity. And then others, maybe are looking to be a bit more precise, both in their pricing and the terms that they offer to customers. Probably most important just to understand your needs, whether you are the foundry licensing the font or the person, using it, and make sure that the terms you agree to make sense.
For sure.
Okay, so let's shift a little bit, because one question I've heard many times, and quite frankly, a question that I have, is can you explain in simple terms, really simple terms, exactly what copyright is?
Copyright is one of the main classifications of intellectual property, and it protects creative expression. The other primary pieces of IP that you think of are patent and trademark. So just to differentiate them, trademark protects the name that's used. Typically, patent is for some invention, and copyright is all about creative expression. So the way I think of copyright is it's a way to protect the humanity of creators, of authors. So for me, it's a super powerful piece of IP, and I think it really does go to our humanity.
Well, and I think it's easy to lose sight of that humanity when we're going through all this legalese and jargon. What does this mean? And what does that mean? But at the center of all of this entire mini-series we're doing is someone's creative work. And, I think in most cases, if a person goes out and misuses a font, uses it in the wrong place or the wrong way, they're not doing it on purpose. They're not doing it to rip somebody off. It's almost always an accident. This actually ties into a question we got from Tim Delger, co-founder of Studio Delger in Nashville. Check them out at Studio Delger. Their work is really cool. Tim asks, what happens if someone along the line makes an honest mistake? For example, a junior designer uses fonts sent over by a client, or something from an old project gets used on an application it's not licensed for. What is the best way for graphic designers and our clients to get square with type designers? And I love this, how can both parties remain creative allies without becoming legal adversaries?
It's a great question. And I think it does go to the humanity of what we're doing. Remembering that there are humans on each side. You're not talking to robots. You're not talking to, some faceless box. There are actual people. So when someone makes an honest mistake, it's really difficult to slap them for it. You don't want them to do it again, but you don't want to be over the top. Generally, licensors, IP licensors, are the same way. They're humans that created this material. They want to see it used with attribution. They want to be able to make a livelihood out of it, but they're not interested in punishing every person who makes a tiny mistake. So I think connecting with a human and being clear about intent is pretty important. That said, the nature of IP laws is pretty much always strict liability. What that means in the copyright context is if you do something, if you distribute a copyright protected work without the owner's permission, that is copyright infringement. No! It doesn't matter whether you intended to or not. That said, my approach has definitely been to just try and be reasonable, assume that everyone is reasonable on the other side, that you're not dealing with assholes. Sometimes you are, but can't really avoid that. As long as you're acting with honesty and integrity, you're going to be hard pressed to find people that are trying to make your life more difficult. Mm-hmm. And I also want to say, I think some examples from Monotype could be important here. So Monotype's philosophy when dealing with instances of misuse is not punitive. We're not looking to punish. The resolution that we strive for is a license, just a normal license that covers the use. So maybe you didn't know or didn't realize that there was a gap up front. We'll just put a license in place after the fact that covers it. So we're definitely not trying to be over the top with it or drive anyone out of business, certainly.
Yeah. So let's flip the question a little bit now, because this is something a question we got as well. What if you are a type designer and you realize that someone is using your type without permission? What is your recourse? What can you do to investigate, evaluate, and then resolve that situation?
So there are a lot of options that you have as an independent type designer. The first option is you try and find a person to reach out to where the use is occurring. So if it's a website, look at their contact us form, or if it's a developer, an application, look for the developer contact info and reach out. More often than not, you'll find that it was an honest mistake on the other side and you'll be able to resolve it pretty easily. If you're having trouble connecting with anyone who can respond to your questions or your issues, there are certain escalation points that you can go to. In the US, there's a statute called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which has procedures that you can go through as a copyright owner to get your content that's being misused taken down from internet sites. It's pretty straightforward if you look at the statute. It's also something that lawyers can pretty easily advise on if you wanted to seek outside advice. Beyond that, licensing through Monotype is another option where Monotype does take on a lot of that protection of the fonts. We do try and resolve misuse or unlicensed use of those fonts. So that could be another option.
This next question comes from one of our listeners. Nick from Washington asks, is there a standard ballpark cost for a font license? For example, if you're an independent designer looking to license a font for a small or medium-sized client.
That seems like a straightforward question, but there are a lot of variables that go into answering that. Not all fonts are equal. They're not all created the same. They have widely different character sets, and a font that supports like East Asian languages is going to cost a lot more than a font that only supports Latin languages or Latin character sets. On the client side, the size of the client doesn't necessarily impact the size of the license. You could have a couple of people that generate a lot of money that require a very small license. They could require a very large license. It's all about like how they're using the fonts. It's not really about like how many people work for the company or what the revenue was last year. It's really about how the fonts are getting out into the world.
Yeah, and I think what Nick is really getting at here is probably something that a lot of people feel is that once you get above those sort of one-off retail font purchases, a desktop license is $50 or $100 or $200, whatever it is. When you start to scale up, it's really hard to know exactly what price range you're going to end up in because there are so many variables that affect the final cost in terms of page views, impressions, usage and whatnot. So, for someone who is looking at more of that mid-size client and above, like what are their options in terms of even getting their mind wrapped around what the cost is going to be?
It can be difficult to gauge when you're maybe a larger enterprise that consumes or uses a lot of fonts throughout a year, web traffic or app downloads, digital content. One way to get ahead of that is through a font subscription service. So with that, everything is kind of on the table. If you're working within that ecosystem, you know what inventory is available and you know the tiers that are available too. Whereas if your font process is based on one-off, purchasing one-off desktop licenses or one-off licenses from different IP owners, you don't really have that consistency. You don't know what to expect if you want to use a font for a particular project.
Yeah. So you mentioned font subscriptions. Let's talk about that because we have gotten some questions about this newer model of licensing. Like a lot of things today, font licensing is starting to shift a bit toward a subscription model. So why don't you walk us through how that differs from the conventional licensing that we're used to?
So yeah, like a lot of IP has gone from like a individual IP license model to a subscription model. You can see that with music, and fonts are definitely going that direction too. Some of the differences are, like when you talk about the different license types, desktop, web, app, etc., each of those have different terms associated with them. Each of those have different license rights associated with them. Keeping track of each of those license rights on a font basis is pretty difficult. So you can simplify things by having all fonts managed under one license or a common set of terms. So you don't have to worry about, web rights, desktop rights, et cetera, for each individual font file.
I'd also assume that having a font subscription would give designers more flexibility, like they'd be able to prototype and update their branding more efficiently if they had access to such a big library of fonts.
Carl, I'm a lawyer. I have no idea.
Fair point, Phil. Fair point. Let's move on. There's a lot of comparisons between a font subscription and something like Netflix or Spotify or whatever, where you can log into Netflix and have, thousands and thousands of titles available, and you can log into a font subscription and have thousands and thousands of fonts available. But I think a key difference between them is in the case of a font subscription, you can go in and play with as many different fonts as you want, but that eventually you're going to choose one and put it into some sort of commercial use, which is then going to go out into the world and create revenue for whatever you're doing. So talk a little bit about that distinction, because I think it's important to understand the difference between watching a movie in your home versus using a font in a design that's going to be part of a business.
Yeah. Fonts are a little bit weird. It's interesting you bring up like the Netflix analogy. If I'm a Netflix customer, I'm a consumer of their content. I log in and I view their shows or videos, movies, whatever. And that's it. With fonts, the people that are really working with them are not the content consumers. They're creating the content, right? So for font subscriptions, a big part of it is that discovery piece. What's available? What can I use? How can I use it? Pretty much every font platform, whether it's subscription or not, has some version of this. For example, My Fonts enables you to see what the fonts look like before you buy them. The difference between a subscription platform is you have all of the IP that can be covered in one spot. You can use those same mock-up tools or prototyping tools within the platform, and then you can easily deploy it as well.
Right. Okay, I have a follow-up question, and I ask this because font subscriptions are still relatively new. Let's say I have a subscription, I'm paying my annual fee for access to a library, and I found something I want to use in a project. Do I need to license it, or am I most likely covered?
Well, it's going to depend on the platform that you're using. Everyone's going to be a little bit different. And I definitely don't want to give you a false sense of what you can or can't do under someone else's platform. But for our platform, for Monotype Fonts, when you subscribe to Monotype Fonts, obviously there are differences depending on the exact plan that you sign up for, but you have the right to go into the platform, view the available inventory, do some kind of prototyping stuff around it, see what the fonts look like, maybe see what they look like in different environments. Most of our Monotype Fonts subscriptions do cover some commercial use. That could be anything from embedding static images into a video file or developing an app. Once you use a font in that environment, we call those production environments, and we call the fonts production fonts. Once you identify that to us, as long as you're within your applicable terms, you're good to go.
Okay, Phil, so we're getting toward the end here, and we've spent 3 podcast episodes and several hours recording behind the scenes. So I'm going to ask you this. Should people actually read their font licenses word for word? Do they really need to or not?
Well, they should, probably. You should read any contract that you care about breaching. If you don't care if you're in breach, then it probably doesn't matter what it says. So I don't read every contract. I don't read every click-through agreement that I enter into. I don't read all website terms of service. But I know that I'm responsible for compliance with those terms. So it's about my risk tolerance. Am I okay with potentially breaching something and the risks associated with that? Or is this something that I'm worried about? And I really want to make sure that I'm clear on what my obligations are and what my rights are.
So long answer short, yes, unless you want to live on the edge a little bit.
Sometimes it's fun to live on the edge.
We're living on the edge.
Indeed. All right. So last question. What do you think is the most common misconception about a font license?
Yeah, so EULAs are written by humans. They're written by people. They're not written by robots, by lorem ipsum generators or AI, and they really should make sense to the people that are reading them and agreeing to them.
Phil, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.
Anytime.
We hope this 3-part series has helped make sense out of the often complicated world of font licensing. Our next installment of Behind the Font will be all about rebranding. We'll cover how to launch an effective rebrand for your client or yourself, as well as common pitfalls to avoid. Look for that later this year. Thanks again to Phil for answering all of my questions and all the questions we received from our audience. And thank you for tuning in. On Behind the Font, we're digging into tricky, technical type industry topics. We want this show to be valuable and worth your time. So if you have feedback or questions, please reach out to us on social or email us at podcast@monotype.com. If you're enjoying this series, please rate and review us and share Behind the Font with a friend. Behind the Font is a production of Monotype. It's produced by Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan. See you back here soon, and keep an eye out for Creative Characters, which will resume in the coming weeks. Take care.